Hi guys, welcome to tonight's journey through one of history's most fascinating and enduring civilizations. Tonight, we're going to explore the incredible story of the Roman Empire, from its humble beginnings as a small city-state on the Italian peninsula to its transformation into the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen, and ultimately its dramatic decline and fall. This is a tale that spans over 1,000 years, filled with legendary figures like Julius Caesar, Augustus, Marcus Aurelius, and Constantine, alongside countless ordinary Romans whose lives shaped the course of history. We'll walk through the political intrigue, the military conquests, the cultural achievements, and the gradual decay that eventually brought down what once seemed like an eternal empire. From the 7 hills of Rome to the distant frontiers of Britain, Germania, and the Middle East, this is the story of how Rome rose to dominate the Mediterranean world and beyond, and how internal strife, economic troubles, and external pressures eventually led to its fragmentation and collapse. We'll explore the lives of emperors and slaves, senators and soldiers, merchants and farmers, all of whom played their parts in this grand historical drama. We'll witness spectacular military victories and crushing defeats, brilliant political innovations and catastrophic civil wars, periods of unprecedented prosperity and times of near-total collapse. This is a story of human ambition and achievement, of the heights that organized society can reach and the depths to which it can fall. Okay friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button. And don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan. And let's dive into tonight's journey together. The story of Rome begins in the mists of legend and mythology, sometime around the 8th century before the Common Era. According to ancient Roman historians like Livy and later writers, the city was founded by twin brothers named Romulus and Remus, who were supposedly raised by a she-wolf after being abandoned as infants along the banks of the Tiber River. The legend tells us that their mother was Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin who had been violated by the god Mars, and that their great-uncle Amulius had ordered them killed to prevent them from challenging his usurpation of the throne of Alba Longa. The twins were placed in a basket and set adrift on the flooding Tiber, but they were saved when the basket caught on the roots of a fig tree at the foot of the Palatine Hill. There they were discovered by a she-wolf, who nursed them until they were found by a shepherd named Faustulus, who raised them as his own sons. When Romulus and Remus reached adulthood, they learned of their true identity and returned to Alba Longa to restore their grandfather Numitor to the throne. Afterward, they decided to found a new city at the spot where they had been saved by the she-wolf. However, the brothers quarreled over who should rule the new city and where exactly it should be located. According to tradition, they decided to settle the matter by taking auguries, reading signs from the flight of birds. Remus saw 6 vultures from the Aventine Hill, while Romulus saw 12 from the Palatine Hill. The dispute over who had won this contest led to a fight in which Romulus killed his brother, making him the sole founder and first king of Rome. The date traditionally given for this founding is April 21st, 753 BCE, a date that Romans celebrated as their national birthday throughout their history. Whether or not we believe this particular origin story, archaeological evidence does suggest that Rome began as a collection of small settlements on the 7 hills overlooking the Tiber River in central Italy. The strategic location of these hills provided natural defense, while the Tiber River offered access to both inland trade routes, and the Mediterranean Sea. The area was inhabited by various Italic peoples, and Rome's early development was influenced by its more advanced neighbors, particularly the Etruscans to the north and the Greek colonies to the south. The early Romans were part of a broader Italian cultural group called the Latins, who spoke an Indo-European language that would eventually evolve into Latin, the language of the Roman Empire and the ancestor of the modern Romance languages. The physical geography of early Rome played a crucial role in shaping its character and destiny. The seven hills, the Palatine, Aventine, Celian, Esquiline, Viminal, Quirinal, and Capitoline, provided natural fortifications that made the city relatively easy to defend. The Capitoline Hill, in particular, served as the city's citadel and religious center, housing the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, the chief deity of the Roman pantheon. The Palatine Hill, where Romulus was said to have founded the city, became the exclusive residential district for Rome's elite and later for the imperial family. The Forum Romanum, the city's main marketplace and political center, lay in the valley between these hills, serving as the beating heart of Roman civic life. The Tiber River, though not one of the Mediterranean's major waterways, provided Rome with several important advantages. It was navigable for small ships up to the city itself, allowing Rome to engage in trade while being far enough inland to be relatively safe from pirate raids that plagued coastal cities. The river also provided a source of fresh water and fish, while the surrounding countryside offered fertile farmland that could support a growing population. Most importantly, Rome's location in central Italy positioned it perfectly to dominate the Italian peninsula, being neither too far north nor too far south to effectively control the diverse peoples and regions of Italy. During its earliest period, Rome was ruled by kings, though our knowledge of this monarchical period is limited and heavily mixed with legend. The traditional list of 7 kings includes figures whose stories may be more mythological than historical, but which nevertheless reveal important aspects of early Roman culture and values. Romulus himself was said to have established many of Rome's basic institutions, including the Senate as an advisory council of elders, the division of the population into patricians and plebeians, and the custom of taking auspices before important decisions. He was also credited with establishing Rome's aggressive expansionist policy by welcoming refugees and outcasts from other cities, and by conquering neighboring settlements to provide wives for Rome's predominantly male population in the famous rape of the Sabine women. Numa Pompilius, the second king, according to tradition, was portrayed as a peaceful and religious ruler who established many of Rome's most important religious institutions and practices. He was said to have created the College of Pontiffs to oversee religious ceremonies, establish the Vestal Virgins to tend the sacred fire of Vesta, and organized the religious calendar that governed Roman festivals and observances. Numa's emphasis on law, religion, and peaceful development provided a counterbalance to Romulus's focus on war and expansion, establishing a dual character in Roman culture that would persist throughout their history. The later kings, including Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus, were associated with various developments in Roman society and government. Servius Tullius was particularly important for his reorganization of Roman society based on wealth rather than birth, creating the centuriate system that would form the basis of the Roman military and political organization for centuries to come. This system divided citizens into classes based on their ability to provide military equipment. with the wealthiest citizens serving as heavily armed infantry and cavalry, while poorer citizens served as light infantry or support troops. The proud, whose tyrannical rule supposedly led to his overthrow around 509 BCE, represents the Romans' rejection of monarchical government and their embrace of republican institutions. The story of his son's rape of Lucretia, the wife of a prominent Roman nobleman, and her subsequent suicide became a powerful symbol of the corrupting effects of absolute power and the need for government accountability. Whether or not these specific events actually occurred, they reflect genuine Roman values and attitudes that would shape their political development for centuries. The overthrow of the monarchy marked the beginning of the Roman Republic, a form of government that would endure for nearly 5 centuries and lay the foundation for Rome's eventual dominance over the Mediterranean world. The word republic comes from the Latin res publica, meaning public thing or commonwealth, reflecting the Roman belief that government should serve the common good rather than the private interests of a single ruler. This new system was built on a complex arrangement of checks and balances designed to prevent any single individual or group from accumulating too much power, while still providing effective leadership and decision-making. At the top of the republican government were 2 consuls, elected annually by the popular assemblies and serving as the chief executive officers of the state. The consulship was the highest regular magistracy in the Roman system, and former consuls enjoyed enormous prestige and influence throughout their lives. The decision to have 2 consuls rather than 1 was deliberate, as it meant that each could check the power of the other and prevent the emergence of a new monarchy. In times of extreme crisis, the consuls could appoint a dictator with absolute power, but this appointment was limited to 6 months and was used only in the most desperate circumstances. Below the consuls were various other magistrates, including praetors, who handled judicial matters and could command armies in the absence of the consuls, aediles, who managed public works, markets, and festivals, and quaestors, who oversaw financial affairs and served as assistants to higher magistrates. All of these positions were held for only 1 year, and there were specific rules about the order in which they could be held and the minimum ages for each office. This system, known as the cursus honorum or course of officers, ensured that political leaders gained experience in various aspects of government before reaching the highest positions. The Roman Senate, composed of former magistrates who held their positions for life, served as the most influential body in the republican system. Although the Senate technically had only advisory power, its collective experience and prestige meant that its recommendations were rarely ignored by the magistrates. The Senate controlled foreign policy, managed the treasury, and oversaw the administration of Rome's growing territories. Senators were expected to be men of substance and dignity, and the position brought with it both great honor and significant responsibilities. The popular assemblies provided a democratic element in the Roman system, allowing ordinary citizens to vote on laws and elect magistrates. However, the system was structured in such a way that wealthy citizens had disproportionate influence. The Centuriate Assembly, which elected consuls and praetors and voted on the most important legislation, was organized according to the military system established by Servius Tullius, with citizens divided into groups based on their wealth and military equipment. The wealthiest citizens, who could afford the most expensive armor and weapons, were assigned to the first-class centuries, and their votes were counted first. If they achieved a majority, the voting stopped, meaning that the poorer classes often had no voice in the decision. One of the most important features of the Roman republican system was the tribunate of the plebs, an office created in the early 5th century BCE to protect the interests of ordinary citizens against abuse by the patrician elite. Tribunes had the power to veto any action by other magistrates, to propose legislation directly to the popular assemblies, and to provide sanctuary to citizens who sought their protection. The tribune's person was considered sacred, meaning that anyone who harmed a tribune was subject to immediate execution by the people. This office provided a crucial safety valve for social tensions and ensured that the plebeian majority had some voice in government. The legal system of the Roman Republic was another crucial innovation that would have lasting influence on world civilization. The early law was dominated by custom and the interpretations of patrician priests, but pressure from the plebeians led to the creation of written law codes that were publicly displayed and applied equally to all citizens. The most famous of these was the 12 Tables, created around 450 BCE, which established basic legal principles and procedures that would form the foundation of Roman jurisprudence for centuries to come. Roman law was characterized by its practicality, flexibility, and emphasis on equity and fairness. Unlike some ancient legal systems that were primarily concerned with religious ritual or royal command, Roman law focused on resolving disputes and maintaining social order through rational principles that could be applied consistently. The Romans distinguished between different types of law, including civil law that applied to Roman citizens, the law of nations that governed relations between Romans and foreigners, and natural law that was thought to reflect universal principles of justice. The development of Roman legal institutions was closely connected to Rome's military and territorial expansion. As Rome conquered new territories and incorporated new peoples, it needed legal frameworks that could govern diverse populations with different customs and traditions. The flexibility of Roman law, combined with Rome's pragmatic approach to citizenship and alliance, allowed the Roman state to integrate conquered peoples more effectively than most ancient empires. One of the key factors in Rome's early success was its approach to incorporating conquered peoples into the Roman system. Unlike many ancient empires that simply exploited their subjects while maintaining rigid distinctions between conquerors and conquered, Rome developed a sophisticated hierarchy of legal statuses that gradually integrated defeated enemies into the Roman community. At the top were full Roman citizens, who enjoyed all the rights and privileges of membership in the Roman state, including the right to vote, hold office, make legal contracts, and appeal legal decisions. Below full citizens were people with Latin rights, a status that included most of the privileges of citizenship except the right to vote in Roman elections and hold Roman magistracy. Latin communities maintained their own local governments, but were required to provide troops for Roman armies and generally follow Roman leadership in foreign policy. Many Latin communities could earn full citizenship for their leading citizens through military service or other contributions to the Roman state. At the bottom of the hierarchy were allies or foederati, communities that had their own governments and laws, but were bound to Rome by treaties that typically required them to provide military assistance and follow Roman leadership in foreign affairs. Even these communities, however, were treated as partners rather than subjects, and individuals could often earn higher status through military service, economic success, or other achievements. This flexible approach to citizenship and alliance building allowed Rome to tap into the manpower and resources of the entire Italian peninsula while avoiding the constant rebellions that plagued other ancient empires. Conquered peoples had incentives to cooperate with Rome because they could see a path to full membership in the Roman community. At the same time, the gradual extension of citizenship created a sense of shared identity and common purpose that bound the diverse peoples of Italy together under Roman leadership. The early centuries of the Republic were marked by almost constant warfare as Rome gradually expanded its control throughout Italy. These conflicts were not part of a grand strategy of conquest, but rather the result of the competitive nature of ancient Italian politics, where cities and tribes were constantly fighting for territory, resources, and prestige. Rome's superior military organization, diplomatic skill, and willingness to integrate conquered peoples gave it crucial advantages in this competitive environment. The Romans developed innovative military formations and equipment that made their armies increasingly effective against their Italian neighbors. The early Roman army was based on the Greek phalanx system, with heavily armed infantry fighting in tight formations with long spears. However, the difficult terrain of central Italy, with its hills, forests, and narrow valleys, made the rigid phalanx formation less effective than it was on the open plains where Greek armies typically fought. The Romans responded by developing the manipular system, which divided the legion into smaller, more flexible units called Each maniple contained about 120 men and could operate independently or in coordination with other maniples, allowing Roman commanders to adapt their tactics to different terrain and enemy formations. The manipular system also incorporated different types of troops, including hastati, young soldiers with light equipment, principes, experienced soldiers with heavier armor, and triarii veterans who served as a reserve. Roman equipment was also constantly evolving to meet new challenges. The famous gladius, a short stabbing sword that became the standard weapon of the Roman legionnaire, was probably adopted from Spanish tribes during Rome's early expansion. The scutum, a large rectangular shield that provided excellent protection, while allowing soldiers to maintain offensive capability, was another crucial innovation. Roman soldiers also wore increasingly sophisticated armor, including chainmail and later segmented armor that provided excellent protection while allowing freedom of movement. Perhaps more important than any specific weapon or formation was the Roman emphasis on discipline, training, and engineering. Roman soldiers were expected to march long distances, carrying heavy equipment, build fortified camps every night, and maintain their equipment in perfect condition. Roman armies were also skilled at siege, warfare, and field engineering, building roads, bridges, and fortifications that gave them strategic advantages over their enemies. The Romans fought numerous campaigns against their Italian neighbors, including lengthy conflicts with the Samnites, a powerful confederation of mountain peoples who controlled much of central and southern Italy. The Samnite Wars, which stretched over several decades in the 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE, tested Roman military organization and tactics like no previous conflicts. The Samnites were skilled warriors who knew their mountainous terrain intimately, and they inflicted several serious defeats on Roman armies, including the humiliating disaster at the Cadine Forks in 321 BCE, where 2 Roman armies were trapped in a narrow valley and forced to surrender. The Samnite Wars also demonstrated the importance of Rome's alliance system. While Rome was fighting the Samnites in the mountains of central Italy, it had to maintain the loyalty of its Latin allies and deal with threats from other directions, including Gallic raids from the north and Greek interference from the south. The Romans' ability to coordinate multiple military campaigns while maintaining their political alliances was crucial to their eventual victory over the Samnites. The final phase of Roman expansion in Italy brought Rome into conflict with the Greek cities of southern Italy, particularly Tarentum, the largest and most powerful of the Greek colonies. When the Tarentines asked for help from Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus in northwestern Greece, they brought one of the most skilled military commanders of the Hellenistic world into conflict with Rome. Pyrrhus was a relative of Alexander the Great, and had learned warfare in the competitive environment of the Greek successor kingdoms, where constant fighting had produced some of history's most sophisticated military tactics and technologies. The war against Pyrrhus, fought between 280 and 275 BCE, was Rome's first major conflict against a Hellenistic army equipped with war elephants, advanced siege engines, and highly trained professional soldiers. Pyrrhus won several tactical victories against Roman armies, but his losses were so heavy that they gave rise to the term Pyrrhic victory, a success that costs more than it gains. More importantly, Pyrrhus discovered that defeating Roman armies in battle did not lead to Roman surrender or the collapse of Roman alliances. As might have happened with other ancient states, the Romans' response to military defeat was to raise new armies and continue fighting, rather than seeking negotiations or surrender. This persistence, combined with their ability to replace losses through their alliance system, eventually wore down Pyrrhus's smaller forces. When Pyrrhus finally withdrew from Italy, the Romans quickly conquered the remaining Greek cities and completed their domination of the Italian peninsula south of the Po River by 264 BCE. Rome controlled all of Italy south of the Po Valley, either directly or through a complex network of alliances and treaties. This achievement was remarkable for a city that had been founded less than 5 centuries earlier and had spent most of that time fighting for survival against its immediate neighbors. The Roman Empire had not yet been born, but the Roman Confederation that controlled Italy was already one of the most powerful states in the Mediterranean world. However, Rome's domination of Italy inevitably brought it into conflict with other Mediterranean powers, particularly Carthage, a wealthy trading empire based in North Africa. Carthage controlled much of the western Mediterranean, including parts of Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and western Sicily, and its powerful navy made it the dominant maritime power in the region. The collision between Rome's land-based empire in Italy and Carthage's sea-based empire in the western Mediterranean was probably inevitable. Given the competitive nature of ancient politics and economics, the First Punic War, which began in 264 BCE over control of Sicily, was unlike any conflict Rome had previously fought. Sicily was an island, which meant that Rome would need a navy to fight effectively, but the Romans had virtually no naval experience or tradition. Carthage, on the other hand, had been a maritime power for centuries and possessed one of the most skilled and experienced navies in the Mediterranean. The Carthaginian fleet was manned by professional sailors and marines. While their ships were faster and more maneuverable than anything the Romans could initially produce, the Romans' response to this challenge demonstrated the determination and adaptability that would characterize their empire for centuries to come. Rather than accepting that they could not compete with Carthage at sea, the Romans decided to build a navy from scratch. According to ancient sources, they used a captured Carthaginian ship as a model and built their first fleet in just 60 days. While this timeline is probably exaggerated, it reflects the Romans' willingness to undertake massive projects and learn new skills when necessary. Roman naval tactics also showed characteristic innovation and pragmatism. Since Roman sailors could not match Carthaginian seamanship, The Romans developed a device called a corvus, a boarding bridge that could be dropped onto enemy ships, allowing Roman soldiers to fight on deck, where their superior infantry skills would be decisive. This invention essentially turned naval battles into land battles fought on ships, playing to Roman strengths while negating Carthaginian advantages. The First Punic War lasted for 23 years and was characterized by enormous battles, dramatic reversals of fortune, and catastrophic losses on both sides. The Romans lost several entire fleets to storms and enemy action, but they continued to build new ships and train new crews with a persistence that amazed and eventually demoralized their enemies. The war finally ended in 241 BCE, with a Roman naval victory off the Aegates Islands that forced Carthage to abandon Sicily and pay a massive indemnity. The peace treaty ending the First Punic War gave Rome its first overseas province, as Sicily was incorporated directly into the Roman state rather than being governed through the alliance system that Rome used in Italy. This created new challenges and opportunities for Roman government, as the Romans had to develop systems for governing distant territories with different languages, customs, and legal traditions. The creation of the provincial system would become one of Rome's most important innovations, allowing the empire to govern diverse populations across vast distances. Sicily's incorporation as a province also demonstrated Rome's growing appetite for territorial expansion beyond Italy. The wealth that flowed from Sicily, including grain tribute that helped feed the growing population of Rome itself, showed Roman leaders the benefits of overseas conquest. At the same time, the responsibilities of governing Sicily drew Rome deeper into Mediterranean politics and made future conflicts with other major powers more likely. The period between the First and Second Punic Wars saw both Rome and Carthage recovering from their devastating conflict while positioning themselves for future confrontation. Rome used this time to consolidate its control over Sicily, conquer Corsica and Sardinia, and deal with Gallic invasions in northern Italy. Carthage, meanwhile, expanded its territories in Spain under the leadership of Hamilcar Barca and his son-in-law Hasdrubal, building a new base of power and wealth that could support future wars against Rome. The Spanish expansion was crucial to Carthage's recovery because Spain possessed rich silver mines and fierce warrior peoples who could provide both wealth and manpower for Carthaginian armies. Hamilcar Barca, who had been one of Carthage's most successful commanders in the First Punic War, spent nearly a decade conquering Spanish tribes and establishing Carthaginian control over much of the Iberian Peninsula. His work was continued by Hasdrubal, who founded the city of New Carthage, modern Cartagena, as a base for Carthaginian operations, and later by Hamilcar's son Hannibal, who would become one of history's greatest military commanders. Hannibal Barca was born around 247 BCE and grew up in the military camps of Spain, where his father was building Carthage's new empire. According to ancient sources, Hamilcar made his 9-year-old son swear an oath of eternal hatred against Rome, though this dramatic story may be more legend than fact. What is certain is that Hannibal received an excellent military education and developed an intimate knowledge of both Carthaginian and Roman military systems that would serve him well in the coming war. The Second Punic War began in 218 BCE, when Hannibal attacked Saguntum, a Spanish city that was allied to Rome. This attack violated the treaty ending the First Punic War, which had established the Ebro River as the boundary between Roman and Carthaginian spheres of influence in Spain. However, Hannibal's attack on Saguntum was probably part of a carefully planned strategy to provoke a war that Carthage was now prepared to fight. Hannibal's plan was audacious and showed strategic thinking on a scale that few ancient commanders ever attempted. Rather than waiting for Roman armies to attack Carthaginian territories, Hannibal decided to invade Italy itself, bringing the war to Roman soil and potentially breaking up the alliance system that was the foundation of Roman power. To accomplish this, he would have to march an army from Spain across southern Gaul and over the Alps into northern Italy, a journey that most people considered impossible. The famous march across the Alps has captured imaginations for over 2,000 years, and it remains one of the most remarkable military achievements in ancient history. Hannibal's army included not only Carthaginian and Spanish troops, but also war elephants that had never seen snow and ice. The journey took 15 days through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe, with the army constantly harassed by hostile Gallic tribes and facing avalanches, rockslides, and bitter cold. Ancient sources give varying figures for Hannibal losses during the Alpine crossing, but it's clear that the army that emerged into the Po Valley was significantly smaller than the one that had left Spain. However, Hannibal had achieved his strategic objective of reaching Italy with a substantial force, and he quickly began recruiting allies among the Gallic tribes of northern Italy who had their own grievances against Rome. Hannibal's first victory in Italy came at the Battle of the Trebia River in 218 BCE, where he used sophisticated tactics, including a hidden ambush, to destroy a Roman army commanded by the consul Sempronius. This victory demonstrated that Hannibal possessed not only strategic vision, but also tactical brilliance that could defeat Roman armies in pitched battle. More importantly, it showed that the Romans were not invincible and encouraged potential allies throughout Italy to consider switching sides. The following year brought an even more devastating Roman defeat at Lake Trasimene, where Hannibal ambushed and annihilated another Roman army, killing the consul Gaius Flaminius and thousands of his soldiers. This victory opened central Italy to Carthaginian forces and caused panic in Rome itself, as people began to believe that Hannibal might actually be able to capture the city. However, the most famous and devastating of Hannibal's victories came at Cannae in 216 BCE, where his tactical genius resulted in what many historians consider the most complete tactical victory in military history. The Roman army at Cannae was enormous by ancient standards, perhaps 80,000 men, including both Romans and allies, and was commanded by both consuls, demonstrating Rome's commitment to destroying Hannibal's forces in a decisive battle. Hannibal's tactics at Cannae have been studied by military commanders ever since. He arranged his forces in a convex formation, with his weakest troops in the center and his strongest forces on the flanks. As the Romans advanced, the center gradually gave way, drawing the Roman army deeper into the Carthaginian formation. At the crucial moment, Hannibal's forces on the flanks closed in, surrounding the Roman army and cutting off all escape routes. The result was a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions for Rome. Ancient sources claim that 50,000 Romans and allies died at Cannae, including numerous senators, magistrates, and other leading citizens. The consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus was killed, along with most of his senior officers. Entire legions were wiped out, and the survivors were so demoralized that many deserted or fled to distant parts of the empire. The disaster at Cannae might have ended the war for many other powers, but the Romans demonstrated the resilience and determination that would characterize their empire for centuries to come. Rather than seeking peace or accepting defeat, the Senate passed a resolution that no one would even discuss surrender. They began raising new armies, calling up men who had previously been exempt from military service, and even recruiting slaves who were promised freedom in exchange for military service. More importantly, the Romans changed their strategy rather than simply repeating the same mistakes. They appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator and gave him authority to conduct the war according to his own judgment. Fabius adopted a strategy of avoiding pitched battles while gradually wearing down Hannibal's forces and cutting off his supplies. This approach earned Fabius the nickname Cunctator, or the Delay. And while it was unpopular with Romans who wanted immediate revenge, it proved highly effective. The Fabian strategy recognized that Hannibal's great strength was his ability to win tactical victories in battle, but that he had strategic weaknesses that could be exploited over time. His army was relatively small and far from its base of supply, while the Romans could replace their losses more easily and control Hannibal's access to food and reinforcements. By avoiding battle and focusing on cutting supply lines and capturing Carthaginian allies, the Romans gradually reduced Hannibal's effectiveness without risking another Cannae. Meanwhile, Roman armies opened new fronts in Spain and North Africa, forcing Carthage to divide its resources and preventing reinforcements from reaching Hannibal in Italy. The Roman strategy was to turn the war into a global conflict that would play to Rome's advantages in manpower and resources while negating Hannibal's tactical superiority. This approach required patience and discipline, qualities that the Romans possessed in greater measure than their enemies. The Spanish campaigns were particularly crucial to Rome's ultimate victory. By conquering Carthaginian territories in Spain, the Romans not only denied Carthage access to Spanish wealth and manpower, but also prevented Hannibal's brothers from bringing reinforcements to Italy. The Roman commander in Spain was Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, who would prove to be one of Rome's greatest generals and the man who would ultimately defeat Hannibal himself. Scipio's campaigns in Spain demonstrated Roman adaptability and learning ability. Rather than simply applying traditional Roman tactics, Scipio studied Hannibal's methods and developed his own innovations in response. He learned to use cavalry more effectively, adopted more flexible infantry formations, and showed the same kind of strategic thinking that characterized Hannibal's greatest successes. His capture of New Carthage in 209 BCE was a masterpiece of combined operations that demonstrated his growing mastery of warfare. The tide of the war began to turn when Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother, finally managed to bring an army from Spain to Italy in 207 BCE, however. His force was intercepted and destroyed at the Battle of the Metaurus River before it could unite with Hannibal's army. Hasdrubal's severed head was thrown into Hannibal's camp, dramatically informing him that his last hope of victory had been destroyed. The war's final phase saw Scipio invade North Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland. The two greatest commanders of the age finally met at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, where Scipio's superior cavalry and tactical innovations proved decisive. Hannibal's war elephants, which had been such an important psychological weapon earlier in the conflict, were neutralized by Scipio's tactics, and the Carthaginian army was comprehensively defeated. The peace treaty ending the Second Punic War was much harsher than the one that had ended the first conflict. Carthage was forced to give up all its overseas territories, reduce its fleet to just 10 ships, pay an enormous indemnity over 50 years, and promise never to wage war without Roman permission. Hannibal himself was eventually forced into exile, wandering from court to court in the eastern Mediterranean, before finally committing suicide in 183 BCE, rather than being handed over to the Romans. The Second Punic War had profound consequences for both Rome and the broader Mediterranean world. Rome's survival and ultimate victory established it as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean and demonstrated that the Roman alliance system could withstand even the most severe challenges. The war also marked the beginning of Rome's transformation from a regional Italian power into a Mediterranean empire, as the territories conquered from Carthage became new Roman provinces. However, the war also had significant costs for Roman society and culture. The devastation of the Italian countryside during Hannibal's 16-year campaign contributed to the decline of small farming that would plague Roman society for centuries. Many Roman soldiers had spent the best years of their lives in military service, returning home to find their farms ruined and their families impoverished. The wealth that flowed to Rome from its new conquests was not distributed equally, contributing to growing inequality and social tension. The period following the Second Punic War saw Rome become increasingly involved in the complex politics of the Eastern Mediterranean, where the successors of Alexander the Great had been fighting each other for control of his former empire for over a century. The major Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedonia, the Seleucid Empire, and Ptolemaic Egypt, were all sophisticated states with professional armies, advanced technologies, and wealthy cities, but they were also exhausted by constant warfare and internal political struggles. Rome's initial involvement in Eastern affairs was supposedly defensive, as various Greek cities and smaller kingdoms appealed to Rome for protection against their more powerful neighbors. However, these interventions gradually drew Rome deeper into Eastern politics and created precedents for further involvement. The Roman victory over Philip V of Macedonia at Cynoscephalae in 197 BCE demonstrated that Roman military tactics could defeat even the famous Macedonian phalanx that had conquered most of the known world under Alexander the Great. The defeat of Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire at Magnesia in 190 BCE was even more significant, as it showed that Rome could project power across the entire Eastern Mediterranean and defeat the largest of the Hellenistic kingdoms. These victories brought enormous wealth to Rome in the form of indemnities and booty, but they also created new responsibilities and temptations for further expansion. The third and final Punic War was really more of an execution than a genuine conflict. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Carthage had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, controlling only its immediate territory in North Africa and possessing no significant military or naval forces. However, influential Romans, like Cato the Elder, continued to view Carthage as a potential threat, ending every speech in the Senate with the phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." The war began in 149 BCE, when Rome declared that Carthage had violated the peace treaty by defending itself against attacks by Numidia, a Roman ally. When the Carthaginians attempted to surrender and offered to give up their weapons and military equipment, the Romans demanded that they abandon their city and resettle inland, effectively ending Carthage's existence as a trading center. The desperate Carthaginians chose to fight rather than accept this death sentence. The siege of Carthage, lasting 3 years, was notable mainly for the heroic resistance of the city's inhabitants, who knew they were fighting for their very existence. The final assault in 146 BCE was led by Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, who systematically destroyed the city building by building. According to ancient sources, the fires burned for 17 days, and when they finally died down, The Romans sold the surviving population into slavery and ritually cursed the site, so that nothing would ever grow there again. This same year also saw the destruction of Corinth in Greece, marking Rome's brutal assertion of dominance over the eastern Mediterranean as well. The simultaneous destruction of these two great cities sent a clear message to the Mediterranean world that Rome would tolerate no challenges to its authority, regardless of history, culture, or previous achievements. With Carthage eliminated and the Greek kingdoms subdued, Rome found itself the master of the Mediterranean world by the middle of the 2nd century BCE. This position of supreme power brought unprecedented wealth and opportunities, but it also created new challenges and problems that would eventually contribute to the fall of the Republic. The traditional Roman way of life, based on small-scale farming and citizen soldiers who fought in seasonal campaigns, was increasingly incompatible with the demands of governing a Mediterranean empire that required year-round military commitments and sophisticated administrative systems. The most immediate problem was the impact of prolonged military service on Rome's traditional citizen farmers. The early Roman army had been composed of property-owning citizens who could afford their own military equipment and who expected to return to their farms after brief campaigns. However, the conquest of the Mediterranean required longer campaigns in distant territories, keeping soldiers away from their farms for years at a time. Many veterans returned home to find their small farms ruined by neglect, their families in debt, and their land sold to pay creditors at the same time. The enormous wealth flowing into Rome from conquered territories was creating a new class of super-rich Romans who used slave labor and advanced agricultural techniques to create large plantations called latifundia. These estates were more efficient than small farms and could produce grain, wine, and olive oil more cheaply than traditional Roman farmers. The result was a vicious cycle in which small farmers were driven out of agriculture, migrated to Rome in search of work, and became part of a growing urban population that depended on imported grain and government handouts for survival. The social tensions created by these economic changes were compounded by cultural conflicts between traditional Roman values and the sophisticated Greek culture that Rome encountered in its eastern conquests. Many Romans, particularly the elite, became fascinated with Greek philosophy, art, literature, and luxury goods. They built Greek-style houses, hired Greek tutors for their children, and adopted Greek customs and fashions. However, this cultural transformation was controversial, as many Romans believed that Greek influence was corrupting traditional Roman virtues like simplicity, discipline, and devotion to the state. The tension between Greek and Roman culture was exemplified by figures like Cato the Elder, who was both one of the most influential advocates of traditional Roman values and, paradoxically, one of the most Greek-educated Romans of his generation. Cato wrote the first historical work in Latin and was deeply familiar with Greek literature and philosophy. But he publicly advocated the expulsion of Greek teachers and philosophers from Rome and warned against the corrupting influence of Greek luxury and sophistication. These social and economic tensions came to a head in the late 2nd century BCE with the reform attempts of the Gracchus brothers. Tiberius and Gaius both served as tribunes of the plebs, magistrates specifically designed to protect the interests of ordinary citizens against abuse by the patrician elite, and both attempted to address the growing inequality and social problems through comprehensive reform programs that challenged the interests of the wealthy elite. Tiberius Gracchus, who served as tribune in 133 BCE, focused primarily on land reform. He proposed to enforce existing laws that limited the amount of public land that individuals could hold, and to redistribute excess land to landless citizens who would farm it in small plots. This proposal was not particularly radical by Roman standards. Similar laws had been passed before, but it threatened the economic interests of wealthy Romans, who had been illegally occupying large tracts of public land for generations. The conflict over Tiberius's land law revealed fundamental weaknesses in the Roman constitution. When his fellow tribune, Marcus Octavius, vetoed the land bill, Tiberius had the popular assembly depose Octavius from office, an unprecedented action that violated traditional constitutional norms. When the Senate refused to provide funding for the land commission, Tiberius proposed to use money from the treasury of Pergamon, a kingdom that had recently been bequeathed to Rome, bypassing the Senate's traditional control over finances. The crisis escalated when Tiberius announced that he would seek re-election as tribune, which was either illegal or at least contrary to established custom. On election day, a group of senators led by the Pontifex Maximus attacked Tiberius and his supporters with clubs and stones, killing Tiberius and 300 of his followers. This was the first outbreak of serious political violence in the Roman Forum since the founding of the Republic, and it marked the beginning of a century of increasing political conflict that would ultimately destroy the Republican system. 10 years later, Gaius Gracchus was elected tribune and attempted to continue his brother's reform program with even more comprehensive proposals. In addition to land redistribution, Gaius proposed subsidized grain sales for Roman citizens, public works projects to provide employment, and the transfer of jury courts from senators to equites, wealthy non-senators involved in business and tax collection. These proposals were designed to create a coalition of ordinary citizens and businessmen against the traditional senatorial elite. Gaius Gracchus was more politically skilled than his brother and initially succeeded in building popular support for his reforms. However, his opponents eventually turned popular opinion against him by claiming that his proposal to extend citizenship to Latin allies would dilute the privileges of existing Roman citizens. In 121 BCE, the Senate passed the first Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a declaration of martial law that authorized the consul to use any means necessary to preserve the state. The resulting violence killed Gaius Gracchus and 3,000 of his supporters. The deaths of the Gracchi marked a crucial turning point in Roman history. They demonstrated that the traditional constitutional system could not peacefully resolve fundamental conflicts over economic and social policy. They also established precedents for political violence and the use of emergency powers that would be invoked repeatedly in the century that followed. Most importantly, they showed that ambitious politicians could build careers by appealing directly to popular assemblies, rather than working within the traditional system of senatorial consensus. The late Republic was increasingly dominated by powerful military commanders who used their armies to advance their political careers and personal ambitions. This development was partly the result of changes in military recruitment introduced by Gaius Marius, one of the most successful Roman generals of the late 2nd century BCE, faced with the need to recruit soldiers for campaigns in North Africa and Gaul. Marius abandoned the traditional requirement that soldiers own property and began recruiting landless citizens who were equipped at state expense. This military reform, while militarily effective, had profound political consequences. The new professional soldiers served for many years and looked to their commanders rather than the state for pay, bonuses, and land grants upon retirement. This created armies whose loyalty was personal rather than institutional, giving ambitious generals the means to challenge the government itself. The Marian reforms essentially created private armies that could be used for political purposes, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the Roman state. The social war of 9188 BCE demonstrated both the growing power of military commanders and the continued tensions created by Rome's system of differential citizenship. Rome's Italian allies, who had been providing military service for over 2 centuries while being denied the political rights of citizenship, finally demanded full membership in the Roman state. When the Senate refused, most of Italy erupted in revolt, with the allies forming their own confederation with its capital at Corfinium, which they renamed Achaea. The Social War was one of the bloodiest conflicts in Roman history, with both sides fighting with the desperation of a civil war. The Romans were forced to grant citizenship to allies, who remained loyal, and eventually to most of the rebels as well, essentially achieving through war what could have been accomplished through peaceful negotiation. The war's most significant long-term consequence was that it created a much larger citizen body that was less unified in its traditions and loyalties, making the Roman state more difficult to govern effectively. The social war was followed immediately by the first major civil war between Marius and Sulla, 2 successful generals who represented different factions in Roman politics. Marius was associated with the popular party that claimed to represent the interests of ordinary citizens, while Sulla represented the optimates, or best men who defended traditional senatorial authority. Their conflict began over the command of a war against Mithridates, the 6th of Pontus, a wealthy eastern king who had massacred thousands of Romans and Italians in Asia Minor. When the popular assembly transferred the Mithridatic command from Sulla to Marius, Sulla took the unprecedented step of marching on Rome with his army. This was the first time in Roman history that a Roman army had entered the city in hostile fashion, and it established a precedent that would be followed repeatedly in the decades that followed. Sulla's march on Rome forced Marius into exile and secured the eastern command for Sulla, but it also demonstrated that military force had become the ultimate arbiter of Roman politics. While Sulla was fighting Mithridates in the east, Marius returned to Italy with an army of exiles and foreign allies. The brutal conflict that followed saw both sides committing atrocities and murdering their political opponents. Marius died shortly after his return, but his supporters continued the war under the leadership of Lucius Cornelius Cinna. When Sulla finally returned from the east in 83 BCE, he found Italy divided between his supporters and enemies, leading to another round of civil war that devastated much of the peninsula. Sulla's victory in 82 BCE was followed by the most systematic political purge in Roman history. He posted proscription lists in the Forum containing the names of his political enemies, who could be killed by anyone with impunity and whose property was confiscated by the state. The proscriptions eliminated much of the leadership of the popular party and terrorized the Roman population into submission. Ancient sources suggest that thousands of Romans died in the proscriptions, including many who had no involvement in politics but whose wealth made them attractive targets as dictator. Sulla attempted to restore the traditional constitution and prevent future civil wars through a series of constitutional reforms. He increased the size of the Senate, restricted the powers of tribunes, required magistrates to follow the traditional cursus honorum, and attempted to prevent provincial commanders from using their armies for political purposes. However, most of these reforms were reversed within a decade of Sulla's retirement, demonstrating that constitutional changes alone could not address the fundamental problems facing the Roman state. The failure of Sulla's constitutional settlement paved the way for the rise of even more powerful military commanders who would ultimately destroy the Republic entirely. The mid-1st century BCE brought three figures who would dominate Roman politics and reshape the Mediterranean world: Pompey the Great, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. These three men combined military genius, enormous wealth, and ruthless political ambition in a way that made them far more powerful than any previous Roman politicians. Pompey had made his reputation as a young commander fighting for Sulla in the civil wars, earning the nickname the Great through his victories in Spain. His suppression of the slave revolt led by Spartacus, and his spectacular conquests in the eastern Mediterranean. His campaigns against the pirates who infested the Mediterranean and his reorganization of the eastern provinces brought enormous wealth and prestige to Rome, while making Pompey the most famous and successful general of his generation. Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome, having made his fortune through real estate speculation, slave trading, and the prescriptions of Sulla's dictatorship. His wealth gave him enormous political influence, as he could finance political campaigns, bribe officials, and maintain a large network of clients and dependents. His role in suppressing the slave revolt of Spartacus, though he shared credit with Pompey, established his military credentials and made him a major player in Roman politics. Julius Caesar was perhaps the most complex and dangerous of the three. Born into an old patrician family that claimed descent from the goddess Venus, Caesar combined aristocratic prestige with popular political sympathies. He was one of the most gifted orators and writers of his generation, a skilled politician who understood how to manipulate both popular assemblies and elite opinion, and ultimately a military genius whose conquests would rival those of Alexander the Great. The informal alliance, known as the First Triumvirate, formed around 60 BCE, allowed these three men to dominate Roman politics for nearly a decade. They used their combined resources to control elections, push through legislation, and distribute the most profitable provincial commands among themselves. Pompey received a special command to provide grain for Rome's growing urban population. Crassus obtained lucrative contracts for his business associates, and Caesar secured the consulship for 59 BCE, and subsequently the governorship of Gaul. Caesar's consulship in 59 BCE demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers of the triumvirate system. Working with his fellow consul Marcus Bibulus, Caesar attempted to push through legislation that would benefit all three triumvirs, including land distributions for Pompey's veterans and confirmation of Pompey's eastern settlements. When Bibulus attempted to obstruct this legislation, Caesar used violence and intimidation to force it through, essentially ruling as a dictator while maintaining the facade of constitutional government. The most significant achievement of Caesar's consulship was securing the governorship of Gaul, which would provide him with the opportunity to build his own military reputation and accumulate the wealth necessary to compete with Pompey and Crassus. Gaul, in the 1st century BCE, was a region of enormous potential, inhabited by numerous Celtic tribes who were wealthy, warlike, and politically divided. The region produced gold, silver, and other valuable resources, while its population could provide both slaves and military recruits for ambitious Roman commanders. Caesar's conquest of Gaul between 58 and 50 BCE was one of the most remarkable military achievements in ancient history. In 8 years of campaigning, he conquered territory roughly equivalent to modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Britain. bringing millions of people under Roman rule and establishing the Rhine River as Rome's northern frontier. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars, written in a deceptively simple third-person style, provide detailed accounts of his campaigns while serving as masterpieces of political propaganda. The Gallic Wars demonstrated Caesar's extraordinary abilities as both a military commander and a political leader. He showed tactical brilliance in battles like Alesia, where he defeated the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix through a combination of engineering skill and strategic patience. He also demonstrated the ability to win the loyalty of his soldiers through personal charisma, shared hardships, and generous rewards, creating a veteran army that was utterly devoted to him personally. Caesar's most famous victory came at the Siege of Alesia in 52 BCE, where he faced the greatest challenge of his Gallic campaigns. Vercingetorix, the young chieftain of the Arverni tribe, had united most of Gaul in a final, desperate attempt to drive out the Roman invaders. He adopted a strategy of avoiding pitched battles while using guerrilla tactics to harass Roman supply lines and gradually wear down Caesar's forces. The Siege of Alesia became a masterpiece of Roman engineering and military organization. Caesar's army built two lines of fortifications, one surrounding the hilltop fortress where Vercingetorix was trapped, and another facing outward to protect the Romans from the Gallic relief army that was marching to break the siege. This double circumvallation created one of the most complex battlefield constructions in ancient history, requiring enormous amounts of labor and materials while the Romans were themselves under siege. The climactic battle saw Caesar's forces attacked simultaneously from inside and outside their fortifications, creating a three-way battle that tested Roman discipline and organization to the limit. Caesar's personal intervention at the crucial moment, leading a cavalry charge that broke the Gallic attack, demonstrated the kind of battlefield leadership that had made him a legend among his soldiers. Vercingetorix's surrender ended organized Gallic resistance and completed Caesar's conquest of one of Europe's largest and most populous regions. The wealth that Caesar gained from his Gallic conquests was enormous, even by Roman standards. Ancient sources suggest that he captured over 1 million slaves, whose sale provided him with the financial resources to compete with the wealthiest Romans. The gold and silver from Gallic mines, combined with tribute from conquered tribes, gave Caesar the means to reward his soldiers generously while building the political network that would support his rise to supreme power. More importantly, Caesar's Gallic campaigns provided him with a veteran army that was loyal to him personally rather than to the Roman state. His 8 legions had shared the hardships and victories of the Gallic campaigns, and they had grown wealthy from the spoils of conquest. These soldiers formed the core of Caesar's political power, as they could be counted on to support their commander in any conflict with his rivals or enemies. Meanwhile, the triumvirate was gradually collapsing due to personal rivalries and conflicting ambitions. The death of Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, in 54 BCE removed one of the personal bonds that had held the alliance together. More significantly, Crassus's disastrous campaign against the Parthians, which ended with his death at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, left Caesar and Pompey as the two dominant figures in Roman politics with no mediating influence between them. Crassus's defeat and death in the eastern desert was one of the most humiliating military disasters in Roman history. The Parthians, who controlled much of what is now Iran and Iraq, had developed military tactics specifically designed to counter Roman infantry. Their heavily armored cavalry and skilled horse archers could attack Roman formations from a distance while avoiding the close combat where Roman soldiers excelled. At Carrhae, Crassus's army was surrounded and systematically destroyed by Parthian forces that refused to engage in the kind of pitched battle where Roman tactical superiority would be decisive. The loss of Crassus and his army had profound implications for Roman politics and strategy. It demonstrated that Rome was not invincible and encouraged other Eastern enemies to challenge Roman power. More immediately, it left Caesar and Pompey as the only remaining triumvirs, making their eventual conflict almost inevitable. The Senate, fearing Caesar's growing power and popularity, began to align with Pompey as the defender of traditional republican institutions against Caesar's revolutionary ambitions. The breakdown of the triumvirate coincided with increasing political violence and disorder in Rome itself. The traditional institutions of republican government were proving unable to cope with the challenges of governing a Mediterranean empire while managing the conflicting ambitions of powerful individuals. Street violence between rival political gangs became common, elections were frequently disrupted or postponed, and the normal processes of legislation and administration were increasingly paralyzed by partisan conflict. The murder of Publius Clodius Pulcher, a radical politician who had been Caesar's ally, by Titus Annius Milo, a supporter of the Optimates, in 52 BCE led to rioting in Rome that destroyed the Senate House and brought the city to the brink of anarchy. The crisis was so severe that Pompey was appointed sole consul, essentially a dictator, to restore order and reorganize the government. This appointment marked Pompey's final break with Caesar and set the stage for the civil war that would end the Republic. The Senate's decision to order Caesar to disband his armies and return to Rome as a private citizen was the immediate cause of the civil war. But the underlying conflict was about much more than the fate of one man. Caesar represented the populares tradition that claimed to champion the rights of ordinary citizens against aristocratic privilege, while his opponents represented the Optimates who defended traditional senatorial authority and the established social order. The war was thus both a personal conflict between ambitious individuals and a fundamental struggle over the future direction of Roman society. Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon River with his army in January 49 BCE was one of the most momentous acts in ancient history. The Rubicon marked the boundary between Caesar's province of Gaul and Italy proper, and Roman law forbade generals from bringing armies across this boundary without specific authorization from the Senate. By crossing the river, Caesar was committing himself to either victory or destruction, as there could be no retreat or compromise once he had violated this fundamental taboo. According to the ancient historian Suetonius, Caesar hesitated at the riverbank, understanding the magnitude of the step he was about to take. Finally, he quoted a line from the Greek playwright Menander: "The die is cast," and led his soldiers across the shallow stream. This phrase became one of the most famous in history, symbolizing the moment when someone commits to a course of action from which there can be no return. The civil war that followed was fought across the Mediterranean world, from Italy to Greece to Egypt and North Africa. Caesar's tactical brilliance and the loyalty of his veteran legions proved decisive in most encounters. But Pompey's control of the sea and his alliances with Eastern kingdoms made the conflict longer and more complex than Caesar had initially expected. The war's outcome was determined not just by military skill, but by political calculations, as cities and kingdoms throughout the Mediterranean had to choose which side to support. Caesar's clemency toward defeated enemies was one of his most effective political weapons during the civil war. Unlike Sulla, who had terrorized his opponents through proscriptions and mass executions, Caesar generally pardoned his enemies and allowed them to retain their property and positions. This policy encouraged defections from Pompey's side, while building Caesar's reputation as a merciful leader who sought reconciliation rather than revenge. The decisive battle of the Civil War was fought at Pharsalus in Greece in 48 BCE, where Caesar's smaller but more experienced army defeated Pompey's larger force through superior tactics and battlefield leadership. Caesar's soldiers, many of whom were Gallic war veterans, fought with the discipline and cohesion that came from years of shared combat experience. Pompey's army, while larger and better equipped, included many recent recruits who lacked the training and motivation of Caesar's legions. Caesar's victory at Pharsalus was so complete that it effectively ended organized resistance to his rule, though scattered fighting would continue for several more years. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered by agents of the young Pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, who hoped to curry favor with the apparent winner of the civil war. However, Caesar was reportedly disgusted by this treacherous act against his former ally and rival, demonstrating the complex mixture of respect and ruthlessness that characterized his relationships with other great men. Caesar's time in Egypt brought him into contact with Cleopatra VII, the brilliant and ambitious queen who would play a crucial role in the final chapter of the Republic's history. Cleopatra was the last active pharaoh of Ptolemaic Egypt, a kingdom that had been ruled by Greek-speaking descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals for over 3 centuries. She was highly educated, spoke multiple languages, and possessed the political skill necessary to maintain her throne in the face of Roman pressure and internal family conflicts. The relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra was both personal and political, as each needed what the other could provide. Cleopatra needed Roman military support to maintain her throne against her younger brother Ptolemy XIII and other rivals, while Caesar benefited from Egypt's vast agricultural wealth and strategic position. Their relationship produced a son, Caesarion, whose parentage Caesar never officially acknowledged, but who would later become a political issue for Caesar's successors. Caesar's months in Egypt, where he reportedly cruised the Nile with Cleopatra and may have fathered a son with her, demonstrated his growing distance from traditional Roman values and customs. Roman aristocrats were expected to conduct themselves with dignitas, a combination of seriousness, self-control, and dedication to public service. But Caesar's apparent infatuation with an exotic foreign queen suggested that he was being corrupted by Eastern luxury and decadence. Upon returning to Rome, Caesar was appointed dictator and began an ambitious program of reforms, designed to address the social and economic problems that had contributed to the Republic's collapse. He reorganized the calendar, creating the Julian system that, with minor modifications, we still use today. He extended citizenship to people throughout the provinces, began massive public works projects to provide employment for Rome's urban poor, and attempted to address the problem of debt that had impoverished many Roman families. Caesar's building program transformed the city of Rome, adding new forums, temples, and public buildings that rivaled the great cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Forum of Caesar, with its temple to Venus, Genetrix, from whom the Julian family claimed descent, was designed to showcase both Caesar's achievements and his divine ancestry. These construction projects provided employment for thousands of Romans while creating monuments that would preserve Caesar's memory for future generations. Perhaps most controversially, Caesar began planning campaigns to conquer Parthia and possibly even India, following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. These plans suggested that Caesar saw himself not just as a Roman magistrate, but as a world conqueror whose ambitions transcended traditional Roman concepts of empire. The prospect of Caesar leading Roman armies to the ends of the earth both excited and alarmed his contemporaries, as it suggested that he might never return to Rome or submit to constitutional limitations on his power. Caesar's accumulation of honors and titles also alarmed many senators who viewed him as a threat to Roman liberty and tradition. He was appointed dictator for life, granted the right to wear triumphal regalia at all times, and allowed to sit on a golden throne in the Senate House. Most provocatively, he was offered the title of king, though he publicly refused it in a carefully staged ceremony designed to test public opinion while demonstrating his supposed modesty. The conspiracy against Caesar involved over 60 senators, representing a broad coalition of his former enemies and disappointed supporters. The conspirators were led by Marcus Junius Brutus, whose ancestor had supposedly founded the Republic by overthrowing the last king, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, an experienced politician and general who had survived Crassus's defeat at Carrhae. Their recruitment of Brutus was particularly important because his family's Republican credentials gave legitimacy to their claim that they were acting to preserve Roman liberty. The assassination took place on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, during a meeting of the Senate at the Theatre of Pompey. The conspirators had chosen this location because Caesar's usual meeting place, the Curia Julia, was under construction, and the Theatre of Pompey was large enough to accommodate the expanded Senate that Caesar had created. The irony that Caesar was killed in a building named for his greatest rival was not lost on contemporary observers. According to ancient sources, Caesar received 23 stab wounds, though only one was immediately fatal. The image of the dictator falling at the foot of Pompey's statue, his blood staining the marble floor while his murderers stood over him with bloody daggers, became one of the most powerful and enduring scenes in Western literature and art. Caesar's last words, according to the historian Suetonius, were "Et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus," expressing his shock and disappointment at seeing his protege among his killers. The assassination of Caesar plunged Rome into another series of civil wars that would last for more than a decade and ultimately destroy any remaining hope of restoring the Republic. The conspirators had killed Caesar but had no clear plan for what should come next, and they quickly found themselves opposed by a coalition of Caesar's supporters who were determined to avenge his death and preserve his legacy. The leadership of the Caesarian faction initially fell to Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and consul, who used his oratorical skills and political connections to turn public opinion against the assassins. Antony's funeral oration for Caesar, as dramatized by Shakespeare, was a masterpiece of political manipulation that transformed the Roman people's initial relief at the tyrant's death into rage against his killers. The reading of Caesar's will, which left generous bequests to individual citizens and donated his gardens to the Roman people, further inflamed popular sentiment. However, Antony's leadership of the Caesarian cause was soon challenged by the unexpected arrival of Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted heir, Gaius Octavius, who took the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus upon his adoption. Despite his youth and lack of military experience, Octavian possessed several crucial advantages. His name connected him to Caesar's legacy. He had inherited Caesar's vast wealth, and he showed remarkable political skill in building alliances and manipulating public opinion. The relationship between Antony and Octavian was complex and constantly evolving. Initially, Antony treated the young man as a political lightweight who could be used to legitimize Antony's own ambitions. However, Octavian proved to be far more capable and ruthless than anyone expected, gradually building his own power base while positioning himself as Caesar's true heir. Their alliance was one of convenience rather than trust, and both men understood that their partnership was temporary. The formation of the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE represented a return to the kind of extra-legal arrangements that had characterized the late Republic's breakdown. Unlike the First Triumvirate, which had been an informal agreement between private individuals, the Second Triumvirate was given legal status by the Lex Titia, which granted Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Lepidus dictatorial powers for 5 years to reconstitute the Republic. This legal framework gave the triumvirs authority to pass laws, appoint magistrates, and redistribute land without senatorial approval. The triumvirs began their rule with a series of prescriptions, even more extensive and systematic than those conducted by Sulla. The prescription lists included not only political enemies, but also wealthy individuals whose property was needed to finance the triumvir's armies. Ancient sources suggest that over 2,000 equites and 300 senators were killed, including some of Rome's most distinguished citizens. The victims included the great orator Cicero, whose philippics against Antony had made him a particular target for revenge. Cicero's death was especially symbolic of the Republic's end, as he had been one of its most eloquent defenders and had devoted his career to preserving constitutional government against the ambitions of powerful individuals. His severed head and hands were displayed in the Roman Forum, where he had delivered many of his greatest speeches, symbolically silencing the voice of Republican oratory forever. The brutal treatment of Cicero demonstrated that intellectual and moral authority meant nothing in the face of military power. The prescriptions served multiple purposes for the triumvirs. They eliminated potential opposition, provided funds for their armies, and terrorized the population into submission. However, they also demonstrated the extent to which Roman politics had become dominated by violence and personal vengeance rather than constitutional principles and legal procedures. The willingness of Roman leaders to murder thousands of their fellow citizens showed how completely the traditional restraints on political behavior had broken down. The triumvirs' next major task was to defeat the forces of Brutus and Cassius, who had fled to the eastern provinces and were building armies to restore the Republic. The decisive confrontation came at Philippi in Macedonia in 42 BCE, where the combined forces of Antony and Octavian defeated the Republican armies in 2 separate battles. Both Brutus and Cassius committed suicide after their defeats, effectively ending the Republican cause and leaving the triumvirs as the undisputed masters of the Roman world. The victory at Philippi allowed the triumvirs to divide the Roman world among themselves, with Octavian taking responsibility for the western provinces, Antony controlling the east, and Lepidus governing North Africa. This division was meant to prevent conflicts between the triumvirs, while allowing each to consolidate his power in his assigned territories. However, the arrangement also institutionalized the empire's division and created the conditions for future civil war. Antony's decision to base himself in the eastern Mediterranean brought him into closer contact with Hellenistic culture and politics, including his famous relationship with Cleopatra, VII of Egypt. While this relationship was probably based primarily on practical considerations, Antony needed Egypt's wealth and resources to finance his planned campaigns against Parthia, while Cleopatra needed Roman military protection to maintain her throne. It provided Octavian with powerful propaganda weapons. Octavian's propaganda campaign against Antony was one of the most sophisticated and effective in ancient history. Rather than simply attacking Antony as a political rival, Octavian portrayed him as a man who had abandoned his Roman identity and become a tool of foreign enemies. The relationship with Cleopatra was presented as evidence that Antony had been corrupted by Eastern luxury and was planning to make Alexandria, rather than Rome, the center of his empire. The propaganda war between Octavian and Antony reflected deeper cultural tensions within Roman society about the empire's relationship with the Greek East. Many Romans admired Greek culture and learning, but they also feared that excessive Greek influence would undermine traditional Roman virtues like discipline, simplicity, and devotion to the state. Antony's apparent adoption of Eastern customs and his public relationship with a foreign queen played into these fears and allowed Octavian to present himself as the defender of Roman traditions. The final civil war of the Republic culminated in the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's fleet, under the command of Marcus Agrippa, defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The battle was probably not as decisive as later Roman historians claimed, and Antony's forces remained largely intact after his withdrawal from the engagement. However, the psychological impact of the defeat was enormous, as it demonstrated that Octavian possessed superior resources and more reliable allies. The aftermath of Actium saw the rapid collapse of Antony's position as his supporters defected to Octavian and his Eastern allies abandoned him. The subsequent suicides of both Antony and Cleopatra in Alexandria left Octavian as the sole ruler of the Roman world, a position that no Roman had held since the legendary kings of the early period. Egypt's incorporation as a personal province of the emperor provided Octavian with enormous wealth that would help fund the transformation of the Roman state. Octavian's return to Rome in 29 BCE as the unchallenged master of the Mediterranean world marked the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. Though this transition was accomplished gradually and carefully to avoid the fate that had befallen Julius Caesar, Romans had a deep-seated hatred of kings, and the civil wars had been fought ostensibly to preserve Roman liberty and traditions. Octavian's challenge was to establish a new form of government that would provide stability and effective rule while maintaining the appearance of republican institutions. The solution that Octavian developed, known as the Augustan settlement, was a masterpiece of political innovation that combined practical effectiveness with constitutional legitimacy. Rather than abolishing republican institutions, Augustus preserved them while ensuring that he and his supporters controlled the key positions. He claimed to be merely the first citizen or princeps, but in reality he controlled the armies, the provinces, and the resources of the state through a combination of legal offices and personal authority. In 27 BCE, Octavian formally restored the Republic by returning his extraordinary powers to the Senate and people of Rome. In gratitude for this gesture, the Senate granted him the title Augustus, meaning revered or sacred, by which he would be known to history. The title carried religious connotations that elevated Augustus above ordinary mortals, while avoiding the hated word king. This carefully orchestrated ceremony marked the official beginning of the Roman Empire. Though Augustus maintained the fiction that he was simply a republican magistrate was somewhat broader than usual powers. The Augustan system, known as the Principate, rested on Augustus's control of several key elements of Roman government. His imperium, or supreme command authority, gave him control over the frontier provinces where most of the legions were stationed. His tribunician power made his person sacred and gave him the right to veto any action by other magistrates. His control of Egypt and other wealthy provinces provided him with the financial resources necessary to pay the armies and fund public works projects. Perhaps most importantly, Augustus commanded the personal loyalty of the legions through his role as their supreme commander and the source of their pay and retirement benefits. The Roman army had become a professional force whose soldiers served for 25 years and expected substantial rewards for their service. Augustus's ability to provide these rewards made him indispensable to the military, while the military's support made him unchallengeable by civilian politicians. Augustus used his power to transform Roman society and culture in fundamental ways. He sponsored a cultural renaissance that produced some of the greatest works of Latin literature, including Virgil's Aeneid, which told the story of Rome's legendary founding while glorifying Augustus's role as the restorer of Roman greatness. Horace, Ovid, Livy, and other writers all produced works that celebrated Roman values and Augustus's achievements, creating a cultural foundation for the new imperial order. The Aeneid was particularly important because it provided Romans with a national epic that could compete with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Virgil's poem told the story of Aeneas, a Trojan prince who escaped the destruction of Troy and eventually founded the Roman people after a long journey filled with divine interventions and heroic struggles. The poem connected Roman history to the legendary Trojan War while presenting Augustus as the fulfillment of destiny prophesied by the gods themselves. Horace's poetry celebrated the peace and prosperity that Augustus's rule had brought to the Roman world, while also providing moral instruction about proper behavior and values. His famous phrase, "Carpe diem, seize the day," reflected the optimism and confidence of the Augustan age, when Romans could enjoy the fruits of their empires. Success without fearing civil war or foreign invasion. Livy's massive history of Rome from its legendary founding to his own time provided a comprehensive narrative of Roman greatness that justified imperial rule as the natural culmination of Roman virtues and achievements. The Augustan building program transformed Rome from what Augustus himself called a city of brick into a city of marble. The Forum of Augustus, the Theatre of Marcellus, the Campus Martis, and numerous temples and public buildings were all constructed or renovated during his reign. These projects served multiple purposes. They provided employment for Rome's urban population, demonstrated Augustus's generosity and civic devotion, and created physical monuments to imperial achievement that would influence Roman architecture for centuries. The most ambitious of Augustus's building projects was probably the reconstruction of the Campus Martis, a large area outside the old city walls that became a showcase for imperial architecture. The complex included the Theatre of Marcellus, named for Augustus's nephew and intended heir who died young, the Pantheon, originally built by Agrippa but later rebuilt by Hadrian, and Augustus's own mausoleum, where he and his family members were buried. These buildings combine Greek architectural principles with Roman engineering techniques to create structures that were both beautiful and functionally impressive. Augustus also established new institutions that would become permanent. Features of Roman government. The Praetorian Guard, an elite military unit tasked with protecting the emperor, was stationed in Rome and became a powerful political force that would play a crucial role in later imperial succession crises. Augustus created a professional fire brigade and police force for the city of Rome, addressing practical problems that had plagued the capital for centuries. He also established a postal system that allowed rapid communication throughout the empire, facilitating both administration and trade. The Augustan religious program was designed to restore traditional Roman piety while adapting ancient practices to the needs of imperial rule. Augustus rebuilt numerous temples, revived ancient priesthoods, and emphasized his own role as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion. At the same time, he encouraged the development of emperor worship, particularly in the eastern provinces where divine kingship was a familiar concept. This combination of traditional Roman religion and imperial cult provided ideological support for the new political system. Augustus's military and foreign policy focused on consolidating and securing the frontiers rather than continuing the endless expansion that had characterized the late Republic. This decision reflected both practical considerations. The empire was already enormous and difficult to govern, and Augustus's understanding that further conquests would require resources and manpower that might destabilize his new political settlement. The major exception to this policy of consolidation was the disaster in the Teutoburg Forest in 09 CE, where 3 Roman legions under Publius Quinctilius Varus were annihilated by a coalition of Germanic tribes. The Teutoburg Forest disaster was one of the most shocking military defeats in Roman history, not only because of the scale of the losses, but because of the circumstances that led to them. Varus was an experienced administrator who had served successfully in other provinces, but he apparently misunderstood the nature of Germanic society and attempted to impose Roman legal and administrative systems too quickly. The German chieftain, Arminius, who had served in the Roman army and understood Roman tactics, was able to exploit Varus's overconfidence and lead the legions into an ambush in the dense forests of northern Germany. The loss of the legions in Germania was reportedly so devastating to Augustus that he would wander his palace at night, crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions." The disaster effectively ended Roman attempts to conquer Germania beyond the Rhine, establishing a frontier that would persist for centuries. This decision to limit expansion proved crucial to the empire's stability, as it allowed Rome to focus on governing and developing the territories it already controlled, rather than constantly fighting new wars of conquest. The Rhine frontier became one of the most important and heavily fortified boundaries in the Roman world, with permanent legionary bases, auxiliary forts, and civilian settlements that created a complex military and economic zone. The frontier was not simply a military barrier, but a dynamic region where Roman and Germanic cultures interacted through trade, diplomacy, and occasional warfare. The presence of Roman armies also stimulated economic development, as soldiers needed food, equipment, and entertainment that local communities could provide. Augustus's greatest achievement may have been establishing a system of succession that would allow the empire to survive his death. Since he had no male heirs, Augustus was forced to adopt members of his extended family and groom them for eventual rule. His first choice was his nephew Marcellus, but Marcellus died young, possibly of plague. His next choice was his stepson Tiberius, a member of the powerful Claudian family who had proven himself as both a general and an administrator in various provincial commands. The adoption system that Augustus developed would become crucial to imperial succession, allowing emperors to choose their heirs based on merit and suitability rather than simple biological relationship. This system worked reasonably well for the first 2 centuries of the empire, producing a series of capable rulers who maintained the basic structure of the Augustan settlement. However, the system also created uncertainty and potential conflict. As ambitious family members and supporters competed for the emperor's favor and designation as heir. Augustus died in 14 CE at the age of 70. having ruled the Roman world for over 40 years. His death marked the end of an era, as he had been the dominant figure in Roman politics for so long that most Romans had no memory of any other system of government. His funeral was one of the most elaborate ceremonies in Roman history, with his body carried through the streets of Rome while professional mourners recited his achievements and the Senate officially declared him a god. The deification of Augustus established another important precedent for imperial rule, as subsequent emperors would also be declared gods after their deaths if they had ruled successfully. This practice, known as apotheosis, served both religious and political purposes, providing a way to honor deceased emperors while reinforcing the divine nature of imperial authority. The worship of deceased emperors became an important part of Roman state religion and helped bind the provinces to the imperial system. Tiberius, who ruled from 14 to 37 CE, faced the enormous challenge of following Augustus while maintaining the delicate balance of powers that had made the Principate successful. He was a capable military commander, an experienced administrator who had served Augustus loyally for decades. But he lacked Augustus's political skills and personal charisma. His reign was marked by increasing paranoia, political trials, and eventual withdrawal from Rome to live on the island of Capri. The reign of Tiberius demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the imperial system that Augustus had created. On the positive side, the basic governmental structure functioned effectively even under a ruler who was personally unpopular and increasingly absent from the capital. The frontiers remained secure, the treasury stayed full, and the provinces were generally well governed. However, Tiberius's reign also showed how dependent the system was on the emperor's personal qualities, and how quickly it could become oppressive. If the ruler became suspicious or vindictive, the treason trials that characterized Tiberius's later years created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that would plague imperial politics for centuries. The law of maestas, originally designed to punish acts of treason against the state, was gradually expanded to include almost any criticism of the emperor or his policies. Ambitious prosecutors could build careers by bringing treason charges against wealthy or prominent citizens, leading to a climate where people were afraid to speak freely about political matters. Tiberius's withdrawal to Capri in 26 CE left Rome effectively governed by the Praetorian prefect Sejanus, who used his position to eliminate potential rivals and position himself as Tiberius's successor. Sejanus's conspiracy demonstrated the dangers inherent in the imperial system, as the concentration of power in one man made the entire government vulnerable to ambitious subordinates. Tiberius eventually discovered Sejanus's treachery and had him executed. But the episode showed how easily the imperial system could be manipulated by unscrupulous individuals. The reign of Tiberius's successor, Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 CE, demonstrated even more dramatically the potential for imperial power to corrupt and destroy. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known by his childhood nickname Caligula or Little Boots, began his reign with enormous popularity as the son of the beloved general Germanicus and great-great-grandson of Augustus. However, Caligula quickly revealed himself to be mentally unstable, engaging in increasingly bizarre and tyrannical behavior that shocked even Romans, who were accustomed to autocratic rule. Caligula's excesses included declaring himself a living god, planning to make his horse a consul, building a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's armor, and squandering the enormous treasury surplus that Tiberius had accumulated. His sexual behavior scandalized Roman society, as he was rumored to have committed incest with his sisters and to have forced senators' wives to prostitute themselves for his entertainment. His building projects were grandiose but impractical, including a plan to extend his palace to incorporate the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. The assassination of Caligula in 41 CE by members of the Praetorian Guard created the first major succession crisis of the imperial period. The conspirators, led by the tribune Cassius Syria, apparently had no clear plan for what should happen after Caligula's death, and the Senate briefly discussed the possibility of restoring the Republic. However, the Praetorian Guard had their own ideas about the succession, and they proclaimed Claudius Caligula's uncle as emperor before the Senate could act. This was the first time that the military had directly intervened to choose an emperor, establishing a dangerous precedent that would be followed repeatedly in later centuries. The Praetorian Guard's action demonstrated that imperial power ultimately rested on military support rather than constitutional legitimacy, and that the guards who were supposed to protect the emperor could also destroy him if they chose. The lesson was not lost on subsequent emperors, who would spend enormous resources ensuring the loyalty of their military supporters. Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 CE, proved to be an unexpectedly effective emperor despite the physical disabilities that had led his family to exclude him from public life until Caligula's assassination. He suffered from what may have been cerebral palsy or a similar condition that caused him to stammer, drool, and walk with a limp, leading many Romans to assume that he was mentally deficient as well. However, Claudius was actually a scholar, an historian who understood the importance of efficient administration and gradual integration of the provinces into Roman civilization. Claudius's greatest military achievement was the conquest of Britain, which began in 43 CE under the command of Aulus Plautius. The invasion involved 4 legions plus auxiliary troops, totaling approximately 40,000 men, and represented the largest military operation since Augustus's German campaigns. The decision to invade Britain was motivated by several factors, including the island's natural resources, particularly tin and silver, the desire to complete Julius Caesar's unfinished business from a century earlier, and the need to provide the new emperor with a military victory that would establish his credibility with the armies. The initial phase of the British conquest proceeded relatively smoothly, with Roman forces establishing control over much of southern and central England within a few years. However, the conquest would take several more decades to complete, and Roman control would never extend to Scotland or Ireland. The most serious challenge came during the reign of Nero, when Boudicca, the queen of the Iceni tribe, led a massive rebellion that destroyed several Roman cities and killed thousands of Roman colonists before being crushed by the governor Suetonius. Claudius also made significant administrative reforms that had lasting impact on the development of the empire. He extended citizenship more broadly throughout the provinces, created new administrative positions to handle the growing complexity of imperial government, and established a more systematic approach to the integration of provincial elites into Roman society. His speech to the Senate, arguing for the inclusion of Gallic aristocrats, preserved both in Tacitus's annals and in an inscription found at Lyon, demonstrates his vision of the empire as a commonwealth of diverse peoples united under Roman law and customs. The Claudian vision of empire was significantly more inclusive than traditional Roman attitudes, which had tended to maintain sharp distinctions between Romans and provincials. Claudius argued that Rome's strength had always come from its willingness to adopt useful practices from other peoples and to grant citizenship to those who proved their loyalty and worth. This policy of gradual integration would become one of the defining characteristics of the Roman Empire and one of the reasons for its long-term success. Claudius's reign ended in 54 CE when he was allegedly poisoned by his wife Agrippina, who wanted to secure the succession for her son Nero rather than Claudius's biological son Britannicus. Agrippina was one of the most powerful and ambitious women in Roman history, and she had carefully positioned herself to control the empire through her teenage son. However, her plan to rule as the power behind the throne was frustrated by Nero's determination to govern independently and his eventual decision to have his mother murdered. The reign of Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 CE, marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and a turning point in imperial history. Nero began his reign under the guidance of capable advisors, particularly the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect, Burrus, who helped him implement relatively moderate policies during his first 5 years as emperor. However, Nero gradually asserted his independence from his advisors and became increasingly tyrannical and self-indulgent, focusing more on artistic pursuits and personal pleasure than on the responsibilities of government. Nero's artistic ambitions were unprecedented for a Roman emperor and scandalized traditional Roman opinion. He performed publicly as a singer, actor, and chariot racer, activities that Romans considered beneath the dignity of an aristocrat, much less an emperor. His performances in Greece, where he competed in various festivals and invariably won every contest he entered, demonstrated his complete abandonment of Roman values in favor of Greek cultural practices that emphasized individual achievement and artistic expression. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which destroyed much of the city, became permanently associated with Nero in popular imagination. Though the story that he fiddled while Rome burned is almost certainly false. Nero was actually in Antium when the fire started and rushed back to Rome to coordinate relief efforts, opening his own palace to house refugees and organizing the distribution of food and supplies. However, his decision to build an enormous palace complex called the Golden House on land, cleared by the fire-fed rumors that he had started the fire himself to clear space for his building projects. The Golden House was one of the most extravagant building projects in Roman history, covering an area that may have included as much as a third of the city of Rome. The complex included artificial lakes, gardens, vineyards, and a colossal statue of Nero that stood over 100 feet tall. The palace itself was decorated with gold, leaf, precious stones, and elaborate frescoes, while the dining rooms featured ivory ceilings that could open to shower guests with flowers and perfume. The sheer scale and luxury of the Golden House symbolized everything the traditional Romans found objectionable about Nero's reign. To deflect blame for the fire, Nero scapegoated the small Christian community in Rome, subjecting them to horrific persecutions that included crucifixion, burning, and being torn apart by wild animals in the arena. According to the historian Tacitus, Nero had Christians covered with animal skins and used them as human torches to illuminate his gardens at night. These persecutions were the first systematic attempt by the Roman government to suppress Christianity, establishing a precedent that would be followed by several later emperors. Nero's persecution of Christians was based partly on their refusal to participate in traditional Roman religious ceremonies, which was seen as a form of atheism and disloyalty to the state. Christians' exclusive monotheism made them unwilling to offer sacrifices to the traditional gods or to participate in emperor worship practices that Romans considered essential to maintaining the favor of the gods and the unity of the empire. Their secretive meetings and apocalyptic beliefs also made them seem like a dangerous conspiracy against the established order. Nero's reign ended in 68 CE when a series of revolts broke out in Gaul, Spain, and North Africa, led by provincial governors who could no longer tolerate his misrule. The revolt in Gaul was led by Gaius Julius Vindex, who commanded significant military forces and had the support of several Gallic tribes. More dangerously, Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, declared himself emperor and began marching on Rome with the support of the Spanish legions. Faced with a defection of the Praetorian Guard and a death sentence from the Senate, Nero lost his nerve and fled Rome with a few loyal servants. He spent his last hours in the villa of a freedman named Finn, where he alternately wept, composed poetry, and practiced dying by holding a dagger to his throat. When he heard the sound of approaching horsemen, whom he assumed were coming to arrest him, Nero drove a dagger into his throat with the help of his secretary Epaphroditus, reportedly uttering the words, "What an artist dies with me." Nero's death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome since Augustus's rise to power nearly a century earlier. His suicide also plunged the empire into its first major succession crisis since the imperial system had been established, as there was no clear heir and no established procedure for choosing a new emperor from outside the imperial family. The result was a year of civil war that demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the Roman Empire and established important precedents for future succession crises. The year of the four emperors, as 68 to 69 CE came to be known, saw four different men claim the imperial throne in rapid succession: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. Each had the support of different legions and provinces, demonstrating that the empire had grown too large and diverse to be controlled isolally from Rome. The Civil War also showed that the armies had become the ultimate arbiters of imperial power, as each claimant's fate depended on his ability to secure military support. Galba, who was proclaimed emperor by the Spanish legions and recognized by the Senate after Nero's death, proved to be too old and inflexible to deal effectively with the crisis. His attempts to restore fiscal discipline by cancelling Nero's donatives to the Praetorian Guard, and his harsh treatment of those who had supported his rivals, made him numerous enemies. When he adopted Lucius Calpurnius Piso as his heir instead of Marcus Salvius Otho, who had expected the succession, Otho organized a conspiracy that resulted in Galba's assassination in the Roman Forum after only 7 months of rule. Otho's reign lasted only 3 months, as he was almost immediately challenged by Aulus Vitellius, the commander of the Rhine legions, who had been proclaimed emperor by his troops in Germania. The decisive battle between their forces was fought at Bedriacum in northern Italy, where Otho's forces were defeated by Vitellius's more experienced German legions. Rather than prolonging the civil war, Otho committed suicide, reportedly saying that he would not allow more Romans to die for his ambition. Vitellius, who ruled from April to December of 69 CE, might have established a lasting dynasty if he had shown more political skill and military competence. However, his reign was characterized by gluttony, cruelty, and financial irresponsibility that quickly alienated both the Roman elite and the general population. More importantly, his treatment of defeated opponents and his failure to pay his soldiers bonuses created new enemies and gave his rivals opportunities to build opposition coalitions. The eventual victor in this succession struggle was Vespasian, who had been commanding the Roman forces fighting the Jewish revolt in Palestine. When Nero died, Vespasian had several advantages over his rivals. He controlled a substantial military force. He had the support of the wealthy eastern provinces, and he possessed a reputation for competence and honesty that contrasted favorably with the excesses of recent emperors. His proclamation as emperor by the Eastern legions in July 69 CE marked the beginning of his march to power. The final phase of the civil war saw Vespasian's supporters, led by his general Antonius Primus, defeat the forces in a second battle at Bedriacum and advance on Rome itself. The capture of Rome was accompanied by significant destruction, including a fire that destroyed the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, one of the most sacred sites in the Roman world. Vitellius was killed by the soldiers while attempting to flee the city, ending the civil war and establishing the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian's victory in the civil war of 68-69 CE demonstrated the importance of controlling multiple sources of power rather than depending on any single factor. His success was based on military strength, provincial wealth, administrative competence, and political legitimacy, showing that sustainable imperial rule required more than just the support of individual legions or regions. His ability to end the civil war and restore stability also showed that the imperial system, despite its flaws, was still capable of recovering from serious crises. The Flavian dynasty, which ruled from 69 to 96 CE, represented a new phase in imperial development, as Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian were the first emperors to come from outside the old Roman aristocracy. Vespasian was born into a middle-class family from a small Italian town, and his rise to power demonstrated that the empire had become a more open system where talent and achievement could triumph over birth and family connections. This development would become increasingly important as the empire incorporated more people from the provinces into its ruling elite. Vespasian, who ruled from 69 to 79 CE, was a practical and efficient emperor who focused on rebuilding the empire's finances, restoring its military reputation, and completing the conquest of Britain. His greatest monument was the Flavian Amphitheatre, better known as the Colosseum, which was built on the site of Nero's Golden House and symbolized the new dynasty's commitment to providing entertainment for the Roman people rather than indulging in personal luxury. The building could hold approximately 50,000 spectators and featured sophisticated engineering that allowed it to be flooded for mock naval battles. The construction of the Colosseum was both a practical and symbolic achievement that demonstrated the Flavian dynasty's priorities and capabilities. Practically, it provided a permanent venue for the gladiatorial games and other spectacles that were essential to maintaining popular support in Rome. Symbolically, its location on the site of Nero's palace showed that the Flavians were committed to serving the public rather than pursuing personal pleasure. While its magnificent architecture demonstrated their ability to complete major projects successfully, the Flavian period also saw significant military campaigns that expanded and consolidated Roman control in several frontier regions. In Britain, the governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola, whose campaigns were described by his son-in-law, the historian Tacitus, completed the conquest of Wales and advanced deep into Scotland. Agricola's victory at Mons Gropius around 84 CE represented the high water mark of Roman expansion in Britain, though the conquests in Scotland were soon abandoned due to military needs elsewhere. The Jewish War, which had begun during Nero's reign, was brought to a successful conclusion under Vespasian and his son, Titus. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple and the dispersion of the Jewish population throughout the empire, events that had profound consequences for both Jewish and Christian history. The triumphs celebrated in Rome to commemorate the victory included the display of treasures from the temple, including the golden menorah that was carried through the streets as a symbol of Roman victory over Jewish resistance. Titus, who ruled briefly from 79 to 81 CE, is remembered primarily for his response to two natural disasters: the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 CE, and a great fire in Rome that burned for 3 days and nights. Titus's generous relief efforts, including using his own personal funds to help disaster victims, earned him the title Love and Delight of the Human Race, and demonstrated the kind of paternal care that Romans expected from their emperors. The eruption of Vesuvius was particularly significant for historical reasons, as the volcanic ash that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum preserved these cities in remarkable detail, providing modern historians with an unparalleled glimpse into daily life in the Roman Empire. The preserved buildings, frescoes, mosaics, and even human remains offer evidence about everything from Roman architecture and art to diet, commerce, and family relationships that would otherwise be completely lost. Domitian, the younger son of Vespasian, ruled from 81 to 96 CE and represented a return to more autocratic rule reminiscent of some aspects of Caligula's and Nero's reigns. He was an efficient administrator and competent military commander who strengthened the Rhine frontier, completed the conquest of southern Britain, and reorganized the Danube provinces to better defend against barbarian incursions. However, his increasingly paranoid and tyrannical behavior, particularly his persecution of senators and his demand to be addressed as Lord and God, created widespread opposition. Domitian's reign demonstrated the tension between effective government and political freedom that was inherent in the imperial system. His administrative and military policies were generally successful, and the empire was prosperous and secure during his reign. However, his authoritarian methods and suspicious nature created an atmosphere of fear and oppression that made him numerous enemies among the Roman elite. His assassination in 96 CE by palace conspirators was welcomed by the Senate, which immediately condemned his memory and ordered his statues destroyed. The assassination of Domitian marked the beginning of what Edward Gibbon famously called the period when the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. The Nerva-Antonine dynasty, which ruled from 96 to 192 CE, provided the empire with 5 consecutive capable emperors who governed according to principles of duty, efficiency, and benevolent paternalism. This period represented the height of Roman power, prosperity, and cultural achievement. The success of the Antonine dynasty was based partly on the adoptive system of succession that allowed each emperor to choose the most qualified candidate as his heir, rather than being limited to biological relatives. This system ensured continuity of competent leadership while avoiding the succession crises that had plagued earlier periods. The Antonine emperors also shared similar values and governing philosophies, creating consistency in policy and administration. Over nearly a century, Nerva, who ruled briefly from 96 to 98 CE, was chosen by the Senate as a compromise candidate after Domitian's assassination. Though elderly and in poor health, he established important precedents for his successors, including the principle that emperors should govern for the benefit of all citizens rather than for personal gain. His most important decision was the adoption of Trajan, a Spanish-born general who commanded the armies on the Rhine frontier and who would become one of Rome's greatest emperors. The choice of Trajan as Nerva's successor was significant for several reasons. Trajan was the first emperor born outside of Italy, reflecting the growing integration and Romanization of the provinces. He was also a professional soldier with extensive frontier experience, suggesting that military competence was becoming increasingly important for imperial success. Most importantly, his adoption established the principle that merit, rather than birth, should determine succession, a principle that would guide the Antonine dynasty for the next century. Good night.